The glittering spires of Calandra loomed on the horizon as the Alliance ship descended through Arvath's atmosphere. Commander Elias Hayes stood at the observation deck, watching the sprawling capital grow larger beneath them. Sunlight caught on dilapidated buildings that had once been the jewels of an interstellar trading empire. Now, they stood as hollow remnants of a civilization that had fallen under the iron grip of the Aldoran dynasty. 2 minutes to landing, Commander, called the pilot over the intercom. Hayes nodded, though no one could see him. His fingers traced the edge of the datapad containing the mission parameters. After months of preparation, the Galactic Alliance peacekeeping force was finally arriving to bring democracy to Arvath, to bring freedom. He'd led similar missions before, but something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the extensive intelligence reports detailing the centuries of oppression under Aldoran rule. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the planet had once been a thriving hub of commerce before descending into isolation and tyranny. Whatever the reason, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would define his career. "The people are waiting, sir," said Advisor Heron, appearing at his side. The political expert was the Alliance's foremost authority on establishing new governmental frameworks. His weathered face held the calm confidence of someone who had witnessed multiple regime changes across the galaxy. "They've waited long enough," Hayes replied, straightening his uniform. "Let's not keep them waiting any longer." The massive Alliance vessel, the Aurora Dawn, descended toward the grand square of Calandra. As they neared the landing site, Hayes could make out the gathering crowds. Thousands of Arvathians had assembled to witness the arrival of their liberators. Their pale faces turned upward, a mixture of excitement and apprehension evident even from this distance. When the ship's doors finally opened onto Arvath soil, Commander Hayes led the first delegation of Alliance officials down the ramp. The air was thinner than Earth standard, carrying a faint, metallic taste. A sea of faces stared back at him, some hopeful, others wary, but all waiting to see what these outsiders would bring. At the center of the square stood the ancient chamois tree, its massive trunk adorned with faded ceremonial ribbons. Under the previous regime, it had been a place of ritualized offering. Now it would witness a new beginning. Hayes approached the hastily constructed podium. Behind him stood representatives from various Alliance worlds, a testament to the diversity and unity the organization prided itself on. He cleared his throat and activated the translation matrix. "People of Arvath," he began, his voice amplified across the square. "Today marks the beginning of a new era for your world. The Galactic Alliance has come not as conquerors, but as partners in your journey toward freedom and prosperity." As he spoke about democracy, self-determination, and the restoration of basic rights, Hayes watched the crowd's reaction. Many nodded enthusiastically, some embraced, tears streaming down their faces. But he also noticed those who exchanged uncertain glances, those whose expressions revealed not jubilation, but doubt. "The chains of oppression have been broken," Hayes continued, warming to his subject. "Together we will build a society where every Arvathian has a voice, where your future is determined not by birth or privilege, but by your own choices." When he finished his speech, the crowd erupted in applause. Children released colorful paper birds into the air, a local symbol of liberation. Yet, amid the celebration, Hayes couldn't help but notice a small group of elders near the back, their faces impassive, whispering among themselves. "A successful first contact," Heron remarked, as they returned to the ship for the evening debriefing. "Though I noticed some reservation among the older population." Hayes nodded. "Expected. They've lived under Aldoran rule their entire lives. Freedom will take some getting used to." "Freedom without guidance can be disorienting," Heron cautioned. "The Arvathians have had every aspect of their lives dictated for generations. We must be patient as they learn to make their own choices." Hayes waved away the concern. "Once they taste freedom, They'll never want to return to chains. I've seen it before. Give people the chance to determine their own fate, and they flourish. That night, as he prepared his first official log entry, Hayes looked out at the city lights of Calandra. In the distance, the silhouette of the ancient palace, once home to Aldoran rulers, stood dark against the night sky. Mission log, Arvath Liberation, Day 1, he dictated. Initial contact successful. The first seeds of democracy have been planted, once freed from their chains. I believe we'll see this civilization blossom again. The road ahead is long, but I've never been more certain of a mission's success. The irony of those words would not become apparent until much later. The first month of the transition proceeded according to plan. The Alliance established a provisional council composed of both Alliance advisors and local representatives. Educational centers were set up in Calandra's ancient libraries, where Arvathians could learn about democratic principles, civil rights, and self-governance. Hayes supervised the construction of new medical facilities and the renovation of the neglected infrastructure. For the first time in centuries, reliable power flowed to all districts of the capital, not just the privileged quarters. Clean water reached communities that had been forced to make do with contaminated sources under Aldoran rule. This is what freedom looks like, Hayes told a gathering of young Arvathians at one of the educational forums. The ability to determine your own destiny, to speak without fear, to vote for your representatives. The youths listened eagerly, their eyes bright with possibility. They absorbed the lessons on constitutions, voting rights, and civic responsibility with enthusiasm that seemed to validate the Alliance's approach. Commander, I believe we're making excellent progress, reported Liana Veris, the Alliance journalist tasked with documenting the transition. I've interviewed dozens of citizens who express gratitude for the changes. Any concerns? Hayes asked, scanning her latest report. Some uncertainty about the pace of change, she admitted, particularly in the outlying districts, but nothing that suggests resistance to the overall mission. Hayes nodded, satisfied. That's to be expected. We're dismantling centuries of oppression. Some apprehension is natural. Yet, as the weeks passed, subtle signs of trouble began to emerge. Attendance at the democratic education centers gradually declined. Public forums that had once been packed now showed rows of empty seats. And though no one spoke openly against the Alliance, Hayes noticed an increasing reticence among the local population. During his daily walks through Calandra, he observed groups falling silent as he approached. The enthusiastic greetings of the early days had given way to polite nods. Something was changing, but he couldn't quite identify what. The merchant guilds have concerns about the new economic policies, Heron reported during their third-month assessment. They were accustomed to centralized contracts under the Aldoran system. The open market is proving challenging for them. They'll adapt, Hayes assured him. It's always difficult to transition from a controlled economy to a free market, but the benefits will become apparent once they learn to innovate without restrictions. Later that same week, Hayes was returning from an inspection of the Northern Plains, where Alliance engineers were installing wind energy farms. As his transport moved through the poorer districts of Calandra, something caught his eye, a splash of color against the weathered stone of a building. "Stop here," he ordered the driver. Approaching the wall, Hayes found himself staring at a piece of graffiti. The script was unfamiliar to him, but the translation matrix in his communicator rendered the message. "Thank you for the chains. At least they gave us a path to follow." Hayes stared at the words, a chill running through him despite the warm evening. Before he could contemplate their meaning further, a group of young Arvathians rounded the corner. Upon seeing him, they hurriedly changed direction, avoiding his gaze. That night, he mentioned the incident to Heron. Troubling, the advisor admitted, but perhaps isolated. One person's misgivings don't represent the entire population. Have we misunderstood something fundamental about their culture? Hayes wondered aloud. All societies have elements resistant to change, Heron replied. Remember Nexus 4? The mining communities there initially rejected Alliance governance, but within a year, they were our strongest supporters. Hayes nodded, but the unease lingered. Unlike Nexus 4, Arvath had a rich cultural history spanning millennia. The Aldoran dynasty, for all its faults, had been deeply intertwined with Arvathian identity. The next morning, he requested a meeting with Alara, one of the most promising local representatives on the Provisional Council, a former scholar who had secretly preserved historical texts during the Aldoran book purges. She had initially been one of the Alliance's strongest advocates. They met in the gardens of the former palace, now repurposed as the transitional government headquarters. Alara seemed thinner than when they'd first met, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. Speak freely, Hayes encouraged after they exchanged pleasantries. I sense that something is troubling you. Alara hesitated, gazing at the ancient chamois trees that lined the garden path. Commander, your intentions are noble. The Alliance has brought many improvements to our world. But, Hayes prompted, but freedom is more complicated than you might understand. She chose her words carefully. For generations, our lives were structured by the Aldoran codes. Every decision, from career to marriage to daily worship, was prescribed. That's precisely why we're here, Hayes said. To free you from those impositions. Yes, but... Alara looked directly at him now. When you remove the structure that has defined a civilization for centuries, what remains? We find ourselves in an ocean of choices with no compass to guide us. Hayes frowned. You prefer oppression to freedom? Of course not, she said quickly. But perhaps there is a middle path, one that honors our traditions while still allowing for growth and individual rights. Before Hayes could respond, his communicator chimed with an urgent message. Reports of disruptions at the newly established voting registration center required his immediate attention. We'll continue this discussion, he promised Alara, already rising to leave. The incident at the registration center proved minor, a disagreement over documentation requirements that was quickly resolved. But as Hayes returned to his quarters that evening, Alara's words echoed in his mind. An ocean of choices with no compass. Was it possible that the Alliance's vision of universal freedom failed to account for the unique cultural context of Arvath? He dismissed the thought. Freedom was a universal desire. Once the initial disorientation passed, the Arvathians would embrace their newfound liberty. Yet over the following weeks, the signs of discontent grew more difficult to ignore. Attendance at the Constitutional Convention dwindled. The draft document, modeled after successful democratic charters throughout the Alliance, met with increasing skepticism from local representatives. They're asking for more specific guidance, Heron reported, frustration evident in his voice. They want us to dictate terms, rather than allowing them to determine their own governance structure. That defeats the entire purpose of self-determination, Hayes argued. I agree, but they seem uncomfortable with the responsibility. Several representatives have suggested incorporating elements of the old Aldoran legal codes into the new constitution. Hayes shook his head. We can't reintroduce tools of oppression into a democratic framework. The graffiti that had initially appeared as an isolated incident now spread throughout Calandra. The same phrase, "Thank you for the chains," appeared on walls, public transports, even the steps of the Provisional Government building. More troubling were the whispered meetings taking place in the shadow of the Marin Forest to the south. Intelligence reports indicated gatherings of Arvathians discussing restoration of order and selective preservation of tradition. The exact nature of these meetings remained unclear, but they suggested an organized resistance to the Alliance's democratic mission. During the fourth month of the transition, Hayes received a report that changed everything. We've identified the leader of the opposition movement, Liana Varys announced during the morning briefing. He calls himself Emeron, though he keeps his identity concealed during public appearances. "What do we know about him?" Hayes asked. "He appears to be highly educated, possibly former nobility. His speeches focus on what he calls the burden of freedom and the chaos of unlimited choice. He's advocating for a return to structured governance, though with reforms to address the worst abuses of the Aldoran system." "And people are listening to him?" "Increasingly, yes. Especially in the older districts and among those who held positions of relative privilege under the old regime." That evening, Hayes ventured into the city incognito, wearing civilian clothes instead of his alliance uniform. He wanted to observe the Arvathians without the filter of official interactions. In a small tavern near the ancient marketplace, he overheard a conversation that chilled him. "The alliance means well," an older Arvathian was saying to his companions. "But they don't understand our ways. They offer us 1,000 paths, but no destination." "At least under the dynasty, we knew where we stood," another agreed. "The rules were harsh, but they were clear. Emeron says we can have both, the structure of tradition and the fairness the alliance promises." A third added in a hushed tone, "A reborn order, tempered by justice." Hayes left the tavern troubled. The alliance had liberated these people from generations of oppression, yet they spoke of their former subjugation with something akin to nostalgia. As the preparations for the first democratic elections moved forward, the division within Arvathian society became increasingly apparent. The younger generation, particularly those who had embraced the educational opportunities provided by the alliance, remained enthusiastic about the democratic process. But a growing segment of the population voiced concerns about the pace of change and the dissolution of traditional structures. Emeron's movement, now calling itself Order Reborn, gained prominence. Though the man himself remained elusive, his representatives began appearing openly at public forums, challenging alliance policies and advocating for a selective return to tradition. "We are not rejecting progress," one spokesperson declared at a community meeting. "We are seeking a path that honors our cultural identity while embracing necessary reforms." The message resonated with many Arvathians, who found themselves overwhelmed by the sudden removal of the structures that had governed their lives for generations. Hayes watched these developments with growing concern. The mission that had begun with such promise now faced a serious threat, not from armed resistance, but from something potentially more damaging: the voluntary rejection of freedom by those it was meant to benefit. "We need to adjust our approach," he told his senior staff during an emergency meeting. "Perhaps we've been moving too quickly. We could extend the transitional period, provide more guidance during this initial phase." "That contradicts our fundamental principles," argued one advisor. "Self-determination means allowing them to make their own choices, even if those choices aren't what we'd prefer." "But if they choose to return to a system of oppression," Hayes began. "Then that is their choice," Heron interrupted. "As uncomfortable as it makes us." The debate continued late into the night, with no clear resolution. The alliance's mission was predicated on the belief that freedom was universally desired. They had no protocol for a population that might prefer structure to liberty. In the end, they decided to proceed with the elections as planned, while increasing educational outreach and community engagement. If the Arvathians could be shown the tangible benefits of democratic governance, surely they would embrace it. The election campaign period revealed the depth of the division. The alliance supported candidates, advocating for full democratic reforms, faced growing opposition from Order Reborn representatives. The latter promised a third path, a governance structure that would incorporate elements of traditional Arvathian hierarchy while guaranteeing basic rights and eliminating the worst abuses of the Aldoran system. 2 weeks before the election, Emeron finally made a public appearance. The venue was the ancient amphitheater at the heart of Calandra, where Aldoran rulers had once delivered proclamations to their subjects. Hayes attended incognito, standing at the back of the crowd. When Emeron stepped onto the stage, a murmur rippled through the audience. The man was tall and dignified, with the unmistakable bearing of aristocracy. His simple clothing couldn't disguise what Hayes immediately recognized. Emeron was of Aldoran descent, possibly even royal lineage. "People of Arvath," Emeron began, his voice carrying easily across the amphitheater. "I come before you not as your ruler, but as your brother, like you. I have witnessed the changes brought by the Galactic Alliance. Like you, I have heard their promises of freedom and prosperity." The crowd listened in rapt attention as he continued. "Freedom is a noble ideal. Who among us would not wish to determine our own destiny? Yet freedom without direction is like a ship without a compass, destined to drift aimlessly until it crashes upon unseen rocks." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. For countless generations, our society was governed by the principles of the Aldoran Code. Yes, there were injustices. Yes, there were cruelties that cannot be justified. But beneath the corruption that eventually poisoned the dynasty lay a foundation of wisdom, the understanding that structure provides security, that boundaries offer comfort. Hayes watched as Emeron moved across the stage. His gestures measured, his words carefully chosen to resonate with Arvathian cultural values. The Alliance would have us cast aside our entire heritage in favor of a system foreign to our traditions. They offer us unlimited choice without guidance, freedom without purpose. Is it any wonder that so many feel adrift in this new world they have created for us? The crowd's response was growing more enthusiastic. Many were nodding, some called out in agreement. "I propose a third path, neither a return to the oppression of the past, nor a headlong rush into an unstructured future. Order Reborn seeks to preserve the structural wisdom of our traditions, while embracing the rights and protections the Alliance has introduced." As Emeron outlined his vision, a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament, the preservation of Arvathian cultural institutions alongside new civil liberties, Hayes felt a growing sense of dread. The proposal was moderate enough to seem reasonable, yet it fundamentally undermined the democratic principles the Alliance had come to establish. Most troubling was the evident support among the gathered Arvathians. They cheered Emeron's speech, their enthusiasm far exceeding what Hayes had observed at Alliance-sponsored events in recent weeks. When the speech concluded, Hayes slipped away before the crowd dispersed. His mind raced with implications. If Emeron's movement won the upcoming elections, the entire mission could be compromised. Months of work would be undone, and Arvath would return to a system that, while perhaps less oppressive than before, still fell far short of true democracy. Back at Alliance headquarters, he called an emergency meeting of his senior staff. "We may need to postpone the elections," he suggested, pacing the conference room. "Give ourselves more time to educate the population about democratic principles." "On what grounds?" Heron challenged. "We've established a clear timeline for the transition. Changing it now would undermine our credibility and validate Emeron's claim that we're imposing our will rather than facilitating self-determination. If they elect Order Reborn representatives, they'll be choosing to return to a form of autocracy," Hayes argued. "Then, that is their choice," Heron replied firmly. "Our mission is to give them the freedom to determine their own governance, not to ensure they choose the form we prefer." The debate raged for hours, but in the end, Alliance protocols were clear. The elections would proceed as scheduled. Hayes could only hope that when faced with the actual ballot, the Arvathians would choose progress over regression. Election day dawned clear and cool. Polling stations had been established throughout Calandra and the surrounding regions. Alliance observers were present at each location to ensure fairness and transparency, principles that had been absent from Arvathian governance for centuries. Hayes visited several polling stations, encouraging participation and answering questions. The turnout was impressive, Lines stretched around buildings as Arvathians waited patiently to cast their first democratic votes in generations. "This is what we came for," he told Liana Varys as they observed the process. "Whatever the outcome, the people of Arvath are exercising their right to self-determination. That alone is a victory." Varys nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "The exit polls are showing strong support for Order Reborn candidates. We should prepare for that possibility." Hayes had prepared himself mentally for a mixed result. Perhaps a slight majority for Order Reborn, requiring coalition governance with more progressive factions. What he hadn't anticipated was the overwhelming nature of the electoral outcome. When the votes were counted, Order Reborn had secured 85% of the seats in the new Legislative Assembly. The candidates endorsed by the alliance, those committed to full democratic reform, had been soundly rejected by the very people they sought to liberate. The announcement of the results triggered immediate unrest. The minority of Arvathians, who had embraced alliance principles, took to the streets in protest. Young people who had been at the forefront of democratic education programs now demonstrated against the electoral outcome, claiming that the older generation had betrayed their future. "This isn't what freedom was supposed to look like," one young protester told Varys during a street interview. "They're choosing to put the chains back on." The demonstrations grew increasingly heated. By nightfall, protesters had surrounded the provisional government building, where the newly elected Order Reborn representatives were gathering for their first session. The crowd's chants echoed through the square. "No return to chains, democracy now or never." Alliance security forces maintained a perimeter, preventing direct confrontation but otherwise not interfering, per the non-intervention protocols that governed their mission. Hayes watched from the command center as the situation deteriorated. Live feeds showed the protests spreading to other districts. In some areas, symbols of the alliance were being defaced or burned. The very people who had initially welcomed them as liberators now viewed them as ineffectual at best, betrayers at worst. "We should increase security around key infrastructure," suggested his security chief. "The situation could escalate further." "No," Hayes decided after a moment's consideration. "No show of force. That would only validate Emerron's narrative that we're here to impose our will. We maintain our current posture, protect Alliance personnel and facilities, but otherwise, allow the Arvathians to work through this themselves." As dawn approached, the protests reached a crisis point. A group of demonstrators broke through the security cordon and forced their way into the provisional government building. Inside, they confronted the newly elected representatives, demanding the annulment of the election results. Reports of the confrontation reached Hayes in real time, along with urgent requests for intervention from both sides. Order Reborn representatives demanded alliance protection against what they termed anti-democratic insurgents. The protesters, many of whom had been allies in the initial phases of the transition, begged for support against what they saw as a regression to autocracy. Hayes faced an impossible choice. Intervention would violate the alliance's commitment to Arvathian self-determination. Non-intervention might allow violence to escalate, potentially leading to civil conflict. Before he could formulate a response, a new development changed the equation entirely. Emerron himself appeared at the government building, addressing both the protesters inside and the crowds gathered in the square. "Brothers and sisters," his amplified voice echoed across the city center. "Is this how we honor our first taste of freedom? With division and violence against one another? The Aldoran dynasty kept us in chains, but at least we faced our oppression united. Will we now tear ourselves apart over how to best govern ourselves?" The crowd fell silent, listening to the man who had become the unexpected voice of Arvathian tradition. "To those who fear a return to oppression, I give you my solemn vow. Order Reborn seeks structure, not subjugation. We will preserve the rights introduced by the Alliance: freedom of expression, fair judicial process, protection from arbitrary detention. But we will place these rights within a framework that honors our cultural heritage and provides the guidance our people clearly desire. From the command center, Hayes watched as Emeron masterfully diffused the immediate crisis. The protesters inside the building agreed to depart peacefully. The crowds outside, while not entirely pacified, ceased their more destructive activities. "He's good," Heron observed, standing beside Hayes. "He's giving them exactly what they want. The comfort of familiar structures with just enough reform to feel like progress." "But it's not true democracy," Hayes argued, though his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps democracy as we define it isn't what the Arvathians need right now," Heron suggested. "Maybe they need this intermediary step, a constitutional monarchy that preserves familiar hierarchies while introducing basic rights." Hayes had no answer. The mission parameters had never accounted for this scenario. A population that, when given the choice, would voluntarily choose a system that fell short of full democratic principles. The following weeks brought rapid changes to the transition process. The newly elected Order Reborn majority immediately began reforming the draft constitution, reintroducing elements of traditional Arvathian governance, while preserving certain rights guaranteed under alliance principles. Emeron, though holding no official position in the new government, emerged as its de facto leader. His influence was evident in every major decision, from the structure of the judiciary to the economic reforms that blended limited free market principles with centralized oversight. For Hayes and the alliance mission, the situation presented an unprecedented challenge. Their mandate was to facilitate Arvathian self-determination, but the outcome contradicted their fundamental values. Internal debates raged over whether to continue supporting a transition that now led toward a hybrid system rather than a full democracy. The decision was eventually made at the highest levels of alliance leadership. The mission would continue, but with a significantly reduced scope. Alliance advisors would remain to ensure the preservation of basic rights, but control over the governance structure would be ceded entirely to the elected Arvathian representatives. For Hayes, this represented not just a professional setback, but a profound personal disillusionment. He had come to Arvath believing absolutely in the universal desire for freedom. Now, he questioned that most basic assumption, seeking understanding. He arranged a final meeting with Alara before his scheduled recall to Alliance headquarters. They met in the gardens of the ancient library, where the first democratic education classes had been held months earlier. The building now housed the offices of the Reformed Republic, Emeron's term for the new Arvathian government. "I still don't understand," Hayes admitted, as they walked among flowering trees imported from across the galaxy during Arvath's trading heyday. "We offered freedom, and they chose constraints." Alara considered his words carefully before responding. "Commander, imagine spending your entire life in a narrow corridor. The walls are close, the path is clear, and while you may chafe at the restrictions, you always know exactly where you stand and where you're going." She paused, gesturing to the open garden around them. Then suddenly, those walls disappear. You find yourself in an endless field with no markers, no boundaries, no clear direction. Is it any wonder that many would long for the comfort of those walls, even as they appreciate the open sky above them? "But the possibilities," Hayes began, "are terrifying," Alara finished for him. "Infinite choice without guidance is not freedom. It's paralysis." What Emeron understood, and what perhaps the Alliance did not, is that our people needed a transition that honored our past while opening doors to our future. Not a complete rupture with everything we've known. Hayes absorbed her words, finding in them an uncomfortable wisdom that challenged his most fundamental beliefs. "The chains gave us a path to follow," Alara continued, echoing the graffiti that had first troubled him months ago. "In removing them entirely, you left us directionless. Emeron offers a middle path, structure with room for growth, tradition with space for progress." "And you believe this reformed republic will protect the rights we introduced?" Hayes asked. I believe it has a better chance of survival than the pure democracy you envisioned, she replied honestly, because it grows from Arvathian soil rather than being transplanted from Alliance ideals. Their conversation continued as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden. Hayes found himself reconsidering everything he had believed about freedom, governance, and cultural transformation. The certainty that had driven his career now seemed naive in the face of Arvath's complex reality. As they parted, Alara offered one final observation. Commander, you came to free us from chains. But perhaps the greater wisdom lies in recognizing when chains provide necessary support, and only then deciding which links to break and which to preserve. 2 days later, the Alliance officially announced a significant reduction in its presence on Arvath. Most personnel would be withdrawn, leaving only a small contingent to monitor the protection of basic rights and provide technical assistance where requested. The news was met with mixed reactions among the Arvathian population. Those who had opposed the Alliance's democratic vision celebrated the development as a victory for self-determination. Others, particularly among the younger generation who had embraced Alliance principles, viewed it as an abandonment. On his final day in Calandra, Hayes stood once more in the grand square where the Aurora Dawn had first landed. The ancient chamois tree still dominated the center, its branches now adorned with new ceremonial ribbons, a blend of traditional Arvathian symbols and the blue and silver of the Galactic Alliance. Below the tree, a small ceremony marked the transition to the new governance structure. Emeron, now officially announced as the first consul of the Reformed Republic, addressed a gathered crowd. He spoke of honoring tradition while embracing necessary change, of preserving Arvathian identity while joining the interstellar community. Hayes watched from a distance, out of uniform, just another observer in the crowd. The speech was skillful, balancing progressive rhetoric with appeals to cultural continuity. Whether Emeron would fulfill his promises of reform within tradition remained to be seen. But the Arvathian people had made their choice. As the ceremony concluded, Hayes made his way back to the waiting Alliance shuttle. At the entrance to the landing pad, he encountered Liana Varys, preparing her final report on the transition. Will you include this in your assessment? She asked, showing him a data tablet with images from the ceremony. It might help explain the outcome to those back at headquarters. Hayes glanced at the images, then shook his head. No official statement from me. I'm still processing what happened here. Varys studied him for a moment. You see it as a failure, don't you? That they didn't embrace full democracy. I don't know anymore, Hayes admitted. I came here believing absolutely that freedom was the universal desire of all sentient beings. Now I'm not sure what freedom truly means. The journalist nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Arvath, that freedom takes different forms in different cultures, that imposing our definition, however well-intentioned, can be its own form of chains. Hayes boarded the shuttle without responding, her words echoing in his mind as the craft lifted off. Through the viewport, he watched Calandra recede, the ancient spires, the sprawling districts, the grand square where it had all begun. So much had changed, yet so much remained unresolved. As the shuttle achieved orbit, Hayes opened his personal datapad and began a final entry in the mission log. Arvath has taught me that freedom is not a universal constant, but a cultural variable. What we perceive as liberation, others may experience as disorientation. The chains we sought to break had, over generations, become supports around which an entire society had structured its identity. In our haste to free the Arvathians from oppression, we failed to understand that sudden, complete freedom can be as overwhelming as subjugation. The void left by removed structure creates its own form of prison, one of uncertainty and fear. If there is wisdom to be gained from this mission, Perhaps it lies in humility. True liberation must come from within, guided by those who understand the cultural context, the historical weight, the psychological reality of the society in question. The Arvathians thanked us for the chains we removed, then asked for a framework to replace them. Not identical chains, but guidelines, parameters, familiar paths through unfamiliar terrain. In rejecting our vision of unlimited choice, they have chosen a future that honors their past while allowing for measured growth. Is this failure? By Alliance standards, perhaps, but by Arvathian measures, it may yet prove to be success. Only time will tell whether the Reformed Republic becomes a stepping stone toward greater freedom or a regression to past constraints. What remains clear is that liberation is not an event, but a process, one that must respect the pace and path of those being liberated. The fundamental question we failed to ask was not whether the Arvathians desired freedom, but what freedom meant to them. Hayes closed the log and leaned back in his seat as the shuttle accelerated toward the waiting Alliance cruiser. Ahead lay debriefings, assessments, and, inevitably, reassignment. His career would continue, though forever marked by the unexpected outcome of the Arvath mission. Behind him, on the planet's surface, dawn was breaking over Calandra. The first light of a new day illuminated the ancient city, where Arvathians were beginning life under yet another system of governance, neither the oppressive dynasty of old, nor the unfettered democracy the Alliance had envisioned, but something uniquely their own. As the Athena research station orbited the gas giant Helios Prime, Commander Elias Hayes, now Professor Hayes of the Department of Cultural Transition Studies, watched the recorded feed from Arvath. 5 years had passed since the Alliance withdrawal, and the Reformed Republic was celebrating its first peaceful transfer of leadership. Emeron, having served his term as First Consul, was stepping down in accordance with the Constitution that blended Arvathian tradition with limited democratic principles. His successor, elected by a council of representatives from across the planet, was none other than Alara. The ceremony combined elements of ancient Arvathian ritual with the transparency of public broadcasting, a symbolic representation of the hybrid system that had emerged from the ashes of the Aldoran dynasty and the abbreviated Alliance intervention. Hayes paused the recording, studying the faces in the crowd. The younger Arvathians, who had once protested the election of Order Reborn, now participated in the governance structure, having formed a progressive faction that advocated for gradual expansion of democratic principles. The older generation, initially fearful of too much change, had accepted modest reforms within a familiar framework. It wasn't the outcome he had envisioned when the Aurora Dawn first descended to Calandra. It wasn't the pure democracy the Alliance had sought to establish, but it was, undeniably, progress, measured not by Alliance standards, but by Arvathian reality. His communicator chimed, interrupting his reflections. "Professor Hayes, your guest has arrived," announced the station's administrative AI. "Thank you. Please show them to my office." Moments later, the door slid open to reveal a young Arvathian diplomat, one of the first to be sent off-world under the Reformed Republic's cautious engagement with the Galactic Alliance. Ambassador Terrelius. Hayes greeted him, rising from his desk. "Welcome to Athena Station." "Professor Hayes." The young diplomat responded with a formal bow that blended Arvathian tradition with Alliance greeting protocols. "It is an honor to meet you. Your work on cultural transition dynamics has been invaluable in shaping our approach to interstellar relations." Hayes gestured for the ambassador to take a seat. "I'm pleased my research has been useful, though I confess, much of it emerged from recognizing the mistakes made during my time on Arvath." "Not mistakes, Professor," Terrelius corrected gently. "Learning opportunities. The Alliance intervention, however incomplete, created the space for Arvath to determine its own path forward." "A path that still includes many elements of the old order," Hayes observed. "With critical differences," Terrellius countered. The judicial reforms alone have transformed Arvathian society. Citizens now have rights and protections unimaginable under the dynasty. Our economy has opened, allowing for innovation while maintaining cultural cohesion. Hayes nodded, acknowledging the point. And the gradual approach has prevented the disorientation we witnessed during the initial transition. Precisely. Order Reborn has evolved into what we now call structured progression, honoring our need for clear frameworks while ensuring those frameworks expand, rather than constrain. They spoke for hours, comparing perspectives on Arvath's transformation. The young diplomat's insights revealed a society navigating the delicate balance between tradition and change, between structure and freedom. Before departing, Terrellius presented Hayes with a small wooden box. "A gift from First Consul Alara," he explained. "She thought you might appreciate the symbolism." Inside the box lay a small metal link, polished to a high shine, and mounted on a base of Arvathian marble. An inscription in both Arvathian and Alliance standard read, "From chains to choices, in our own time, on our own terms." Hayes ran his finger over the smooth metal, recognizing it as a link from the ceremonial chains that had once adorned the ancient chamois tree in Calandra's central square. "Please convey my gratitude to First Consul Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and my admiration for what Arvath has accomplished." After the ambassador departed, Hayes returned to the observation deck, gazing out at the stars. Somewhere out there, Alliance peacekeeping missions continued, bringing the promise of democracy to worlds emerging from oppression. He wondered how many would follow the expected path, and how many would chart their own course, as Arvath had done. He had spent years analyzing the Arvath mission, identifying the critical misunderstandings, the cultural blind spots, the assumptions that had undermined the Alliance's well-intentioned efforts. His research now informed pre-mission cultural immersion programs, encouraging intervention teams to ask not just, "How do we bring freedom?" but "What does freedom mean in this specific context?" The link from the ceremonial chain sat on his desk, a constant reminder of the lesson Arvath had taught him, that sometimes what looks like regression may actually be adaptation. What appears as resistance may be self-preservation. The true measure of liberation was not how closely a society adhered to Alliance ideals, but how authentically it expressed its own evolving identity. For Arvath, that meant the reformed republic with its blend of tradition and innovation. For other worlds, the path might be entirely different. As he watched the stars, Hayes thought about the graffiti that had first signaled trouble during the mission. "Thank you for the chains. At least they gave us a path to follow." He understood now what he couldn't then. The Arvathians hadn't been thanking their oppressors. They had been expressing the profound disorientation that comes when all familiar structures are suddenly removed. They had been articulating a truth the Alliance had failed to grasp, that freedom without context is not liberation, but abandonment. The greatest gift the Alliance could offer was not the imposition of its own vision of freedom, but the space for each world to define freedom on its own terms. Sometimes that meant breaking all chains. Sometimes it meant transforming them into guideposts along a new path. On Arvath, the sun was rising over Calandra, a new day in a society that had neither returned fully to its past nor embraced completely the future the Alliance had envisioned. Instead, it had found a third path, one that honored its history while creating space for growth, one that recognized both the burden of unlimited choice and the oppression of no choice at all. It wasn't the outcome Hayes had expected when he first set foot on Arvathian soil, but perhaps it was the outcome the Arvathians had needed all along. As the first light of dawn illuminated the ancient city, it caught on the flags that now flew from government buildings, the traditional symbols of Arvathian identity, alongside the new emblem of the Reformed Republic. Not a complete break with the past, but a transformation. Not freedom as the Alliance defined it, but freedom as the Arvathians had chosen to embrace it. In the end, perhaps that was the only freedom that truly mattered.